to Rad Futures again, Alan.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So is that better? Maybe that's better. I don't know.
It's a
Okay.
little darker, actually.
Is that better?
I'd say that's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk to you. It's been a long time. It's been like 2 or 3 years, I think, 2 years since we
Quite some
last
time.
spoke. A lot has been going on in the world of student loan debt forgiveness. Obviously, we've had the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. Biden did a couple things, which we'll get into later. But you kind of told me when we were speaking briefly over the phone last week that you told me about your documentary. So it's called Lone Wolves. And I'm just wondering, for people who are watching who might be interested in that, if you're watching, by the way, and you've never seen any of my interviews with Alan before, Alan runs studentloanjustice.org. He is the first person in the United States to start a nonprofit that is solely focused on pressing for the reinstatement of bankruptcy protections for student loan borrowers. And he focuses completely on student loan debt for people, bringing justice to the situation for people who are in massive amounts of debt who cannot climb their way out. And maybe you want to add something to that.
Sure. We focus on, well, first of all, we're actually not technically a legal nonprofit. In fact, we are a truly informal grassroots organization with no formal legal structure. We did that for a very good reason. There are a lot of freedom of speech curtailments that come with 501c whatevers. And so we are very loud and proud about being a completely grassroots group. We survive only on personal gifts from people, which is usually not much more than $3,000 a month or so, but it's enough to get me by. And we're fighting for two things. We're fighting, number one, and this has always been true, for the return of bankruptcy rights to student loans.
Mm-hmm.
The core of the entire student loan catastrophe lies in the unconstitutional stripping of this protection uniquely away from student loans. Nobody wants to file for bankruptcy. It's a very difficult thing to fight for, just psychologically for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But the founding fathers knew that bankruptcy rights were so important, they called for it in the Constitution, ahead of the power to declare war, ahead of the power to raise an army, ahead of every right listed in the Bill of Rights, in fact. And so that's our core mission. Beyond that, the president, the secretary of education, who still exists, by the way, the Department of Education still exists, still owns these loans. The secretary, under order from the president, can cancel 90% of all federal student loan debt, federally owned 100% of all
Within
federally
their legal
owned
purview
student
to be
loans.
able to do that.
Yes, and we can get into this later, but we were very unhappy with what we saw Joe Biden do with his student loan cancellation effort. He didn't use the right law. But make no mistake, the secretary can still cancel 90% of all student loan debt in this country.
Yeah.
So we continue to fight for that, but it's pretty clear that unless and until we, the borrowers, have the leverage of bankruptcy rights returned, we have no power, and we're not going to see any meaningful student loan cancellation until we get that toothpick of power back, as the founders wanted us to have.
Okay. I'm going to stop you for a second. So for anyone who's just joining me, who has not seen Alan before, and you're interested in his work, you can head over to studentloanjustice.org and check him out. And then I was wondering if you can also kind of go into real quickly, tell me about the Lone Wolves documentary. Who did you do it with? Where is it released? Can people find it somewhere? How long is it? What's...
Yeah, we did the Lone Wolves documentary, and you can just Google that and find it pretty easily. It's on the Peacock network. It originally aired nationwide on MSNBC in December 2022. The documentary is still as relevant as it ever was. But there's one small caveat there. When we released that documentary, it was timed exactly so that Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois
Mhm.
would be compelled to pass a very important bankruptcy bill that he had sponsored along with Republicans, John Cornyn and Josh Hawley of Texas and Missouri, respectively. It was a really good bill. It would have returned limited, but still very good bankruptcy rights to student loans. Would have also clawed back a token amount from the colleges, which is something the Republicans were asking for. It was a great bill. It was poised to pass. And I'm sorry to report that Dick Durbin and the Democrats pulled the rug out from under that bill at the very last
Yeah,
minute.
tell me about that. So at
Extremely
the last
disappointing.
minute, he pulled it out. He pulled out the
Well,
bankruptcy. Okay.
yeah, here's the inside scoop. And remember, we're a fiercely nonpartisan group. We started out the first 10 or so years of our existence kind of aligned with the Democrats, but I have to tell you that over the past 10 years, we've come to realize that both parties are really against student loan borrowers. Their rhetoric is far different, but the fact of the matter is, with this particular bill, we saw people like Elizabeth Warren go to some lengths to kill this bill.
Yeah.
Um, there was a key meeting for the companion bill in the House, a key conference that was going to happen, a hearing. And about an hour before that hearing was to happen, Elizabeth Warren called a news conference saying, "Hey, look at the bankruptcy bill that I'm going to introduce at some point in the future. That this is where everybody should be paying attention to, et
Mhm.
cetera, et cetera." And like within minutes after that press conference, they canceled that hearing. And so I was like, what's going on here? And then lo and behold, a week or so after that, Senator Durbin's staff gave us the bad news that they were not going to advance the bill, despite the fact that they had ample bipartisan support for it. Um, they
Why do
really
you
betrayed us, and they really the Democrats.
why do you think she did that? Why? Because she right, I mean, as far as the public and the press is concerned, she's always painted as being, progressive.
Well, she was asked by the Boston Globe whether she supported this legislation or not, and she would not answer the question. She only said, "I don't want to compete against myself," or something to that effect. So it would seem to me that she had political ambitions, and it was those personal political ambitions that overrode actually getting something done. And remember, the Democrats had a decades long standing promise to return bankruptcy rights to student loans. The 2000 to 2020, 2022 congressional session, it was a very rare occurrence where the Democrats held control of both the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It was their one shot in a long time to make good on that promise. And they just completely they whiffed it. They spit the bit, and this was a very major betrayal of student loan borrowers. And in the ensuing 2 years, the Democrats refused to put up any bankruptcy legislation and push it. They just wouldn't do it. Lo
Can
and
I ask you
behold,
something?
yeah, sure.
Are you aware of, and you've been doing this for a long time now, right? When did you start student loan justice?
March 2005.
Okay.
So it has been 20 years now.
Right. So
I'm
in your
actually the
20,
first activist in the country on the student loan issue.
yeah. So in your 20 years of experience trying to fight for the rights of people to be free of this burdensome, crippling debt, have you become aware or witnessed or heard about, even through the grapevine, any kind of, maybe scenarios where uh, some of the lenders are lobbying these politicians?
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt. And they lobby both sides of the aisle, make no mistake.
Right.
I'd say our primary adversaries, and there's a lot of them, they tend to be on the conservative side, but that is not absolutely true by any means.
Right.
The for-profit colleges, the lending companies, they all lobby very hard against us. And I will say, this is a key point that brings us back to the current story. The reason that the Democrats ultimately abandoned that bill, what
Mhm.
they told us was that it was because the historically black colleges and universities opposed the bill. Because, as I said, there was a modest clawback in this bill whereby, at least on paper,
Uh-huh.
um, the colleges were put on the hook to reimburse the Department of Education for up to half of the amount originally borrowed in the case of a discharge in bankruptcy. But it was on a sliding scale. So, the colleges might pay zero even if they had discharges because their repayment rates were high. But it was a sliding scale based on repayment rates and default rates.
Mhm.
Um, but, the Department of Education never enforces penalties like that. We
Mhm.
saw many penalties that came along with something called the gainful employment rule, where colleges could be kicked out of participation in the lending program if their default rates and their student outcomes were bad enough. But the Department of Education never enforces those kinds of things. The historically
Sure.
black colleges and universities totally know this. All the colleges know it. So my best guess, and it's pretty obvious, in fact, it's extremely obvious to me, was that the HBCUs were put up as Teflon. So the for-profit colleges, many colleges, were actually behind that opposition, but they put the HBCUs up front and center
As a
um,
shield.
as a shield, as a political shield. That's right. Because the fact of the matter is, nobody wants to attack the HBCUs. That's a very bad look.
Right.
Makes you look racist, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But I've seen this game happen before, like for example, with the gainful employment rule that I just alluded to a few minutes ago. Um, this is one of the many tricks, political tricks that happens in Washington D.C., where bad people line up behind uh, a politically Tefloned or
Mhm.
bulletproof um, person or figure or group or whatever the
Sure.
case may be, um, to kill very good legislation. And that's what happened here. And shame, shame on the HBCUs. People of color, black people are hurt so much worse than what is typical by these loans.
Correct.
This was just a blatant
Yeah.
punch in the gut to African American people everywhere with student loans. Um,
And let's
and
talk, I'm gonna interrupt you for one minute
sure,
here
yeah,
because I don't wanna forget what I'm thinking about. With regards to this, right, we're talking about, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, um, because of slavery, because of the destruction of Bronzevilles all over the United States, because of these sorts of issues, the Black communities all over the US have historically been left in tatters, right? Economically, a lot of their economic centers were destroyed when the Bronzevilles were destroyed around the New Deal. So, yeah, I think it's ironic and also very disgusting and sad that they were used in this way.
it's
Um,
cruel. It's just cruel. And I'm probably because of the Teflon and the fear of being seen as a racist. I'm probably not the guy to confront the HBCUs about that, but I would urge all people of color out there, particularly if they graduated from an HBCU, particularly if they are being ruined by their student loan debt, take it up with the Black Congressional Caucus,
yeah.
with the HBCU political group. There's a White House group you can find that represents the HBCUs. These people need to be taken to task because
Yeah.
they are completely exploiting their position, exploiting and wrecking their own people. And
And,
shame on them.
yes, I agree. That's also not to say, I don't want to make it sound like there aren't people within the HBCUs that are complicit, right? There are people who accepted this bargain.
Yes.
There are people within them that accepted this and put everybody else out to pasture, you know?
They sold not only their own people out, they sold their own people down the river. They sold the entire country down the river,
Yeah,
43 million people. And they sold them out to the colleges, to the Department of Education, to the lenders. And yeah, one can only imagine all the quid pro quos that were going on in the background,
mhm,
all the nonprofits that got huge donations for who knows
yeah.
why. There's all kinds of ways to corrupt political entities. And, I would even mention the Black Congressional Caucus as well, but I don't have any hard proof on this particular instance, but I did see with my own eyes the Black Congressional Caucus turn against something called the gainful employment rule about
So
10
tell me
or
about that. What is that?
well, the gainful employment rule was a pretty feeble attempt to crack the whip on the colleges, where if their students didn't have good outcomes, if they weren't able to use their degree, if they weren't gainfully employed a few years after leaving school, then the colleges could be kicked out of the lending program and they could suffer a lot of penalties.
Yeah,
And it was kind of a good idea. I thought it was worth supporting anyhow. But the Black Congressional Caucus and other civil rights leaders, and I hate to say it because I really like the guy, Jesse Jackson at the Rainbow Coalition. And, I like Jesse Jackson, but I saw this thing happen with my own eyes, and it was really disgusting to watch how the colleges, how the lenders had completely corrupted that whole process.
mm,
So when gainful employment finally happened, it was toothless. And I don't think even 4 colleges suffered any penalties or anything from that entire exercise. It was just a
yeah,
massive waste of everybody's time. It came to nothing. And it was just painful. It was painful to watch. It was Washington corruption on full display.
yeah. And I think, one of the other things that I've been thinking about the last few days in particular, and I did not bring up with you when we spoke on the phone because it wasn't on my mind then, is this issue of complicity as far as the colleges themselves are concerned. So we often, in our past interviews, we focused mainly and heavily on the lender and the lending institutions themselves, and how narratives are spun in their favor and things like that. But let's not forget, right? Let's not forget the very important part that the colleges themselves have played in this entire debacle. Because as someone myself, I think the gainful employment rule is fantastic, actually, because I can tell you, um, many colleges, even those state universities, many colleges will not counsel students. They will not point them in any sort of helpful direction toward any kind of gainful employment uh, leading up to graduation or after graduation. You would think that this would be something that at least the alumni offices would have some kind of a plan or a protocol for, how many, I would be curious, how many recent graduates are exiting and looking for employment. How many can't find a job? Because I know in my personal experience, I spent quite a bit of time getting an undergraduate degree, 2 degrees actually. And upon leaving, it was very difficult to find a job. Most people would say, oh, well, that's because you didn't go for the right degree. You should have gone for finance or engineering or something along those lines, right? But the thing they don't understand is when you're in the mix of the system, when you're in the mix of the college system, you have advisors who are counseling you, who are at every level telling you, if you're in the liberal arts, for instance, if this is what you love, you should keep doing it. If you want to do graduate school, here are the steps you need to take. all the while not really presenting a realistic picture of what the job market is like once you exit the program, right? Um, so
Yeah.
I think that the complicity of the colleges themselves is highly important in this equation of accountability. I think that they need to be held accountable, and they haven't been thus far. In fact, they continue to be one of the mechanisms by which the lending institutions continue to thrive because they are largely unchecked. So what do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we don't have nearly enough time to do justice to what you just said, but you're absolutely right. The complicity of the colleges is, in many ways, it's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
The colleges sit in the catbird's seat. They
Yep.
get all of that student loan money, just about, um, and they have the most perverted incentives. They make more money the longer they can keep a kid in school. So we've seen the time to graduate go from 4 years for a 4-year degree to an average of 6.3 years to get a 4 degree. That's the average. And 40% of the students never even graduate.
Right.
The college, and if you look at any student loan counseling that the colleges are by law required to do, they never make it clear that, unlike all other loans, there are essentially no bankruptcy protections for student loans.
Mhm.
What they'll say is you can discharge your loans in bankruptcy if you can prove undue hardship,
Mhm.
right? And to an 18-year-old kid, that sounds reasonable, as you're already in a state of duress anyways because you're trying to register for class and you're just getting through this stupid loan counseling thing. If you even read that line, that says you can discharge your loans in bankruptcy if you can prove undue hardship. You go, yep, okay, yep, looks good, okay, good, and then you sign the loans. But the fact of the matter is, student loans are essentially impossible to discharge in bankruptcy. Um,
100%.
well, just about.
Yeah.
Technically, you can get a discharge, but what we've seen is that of around 300,000 people who filed for bankruptcy over the past 2 years and had student loans, not even maybe, and we don't know the exact number, but it's something like 50, maybe 100 people actually got discharges.
Yeah,
So
most of
we're
them are
talking about a
rejected.
success rate. You can win the lottery. You can technically say that's true as well, but
Mhm.
those are the sorts of odds you're looking at on trying to discharge your student loans in bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Um, and the colleges universally never tell the students. I've never found even one instance where any college ever told the students that there were no statutes of limitations
Mhm.
on these loans. That's a protection that allows the loans to become immortal, to follow the borrower literally for the rest of their lives. So these are two very important elements that are unique to student loans that is never disclosed. The parents, their kids, they are never told
Yeah.
explicitly that these two rights are gone. And meanwhile, the colleges have carte blanche to charge whatever they want in many cases.
That's it.
For
Yeah.
parent plus, grad plus loans, there's no limit on how much they can borrow.
Yeah.
And so the colleges are completely complicit. They are the major beneficiary of these loans. And I think I can maybe find exactly one instance where a college president called or even mentioned bankruptcy and student loans in the same sentence. So these college presidents everywhere, from Harvard down to Joe's truck driving school, they will simply not talk about bankruptcy and student loans. It's the core of the whole problem.
Mhm.
Um, a couple of presidents might have spoken out about loan cancellation. Maybe I'm sure a few probably did that I didn't really pay attention to. But the college presidents, as a group, ought to be absolutely ashamed of themselves. And to your other point, the colleges have apparently made the decision that getting that student loan money is far more important to them than their alumni donating to them later on in life.
Right.
Like, so, I their priorities are completely skewed away from the welfare of their own community, their own students and alumni, and
Yeah.
only towards increasing the debt that they are slapping on those people. It's just disgusting in every way. And I don't want to say anything too radical, but at some point, people are losing their minds right now about student loans. We're
Say it.
seeing,
This is Rad Futures. This is the place to be radical.
well, Justin Moan, guy in Pennsylvania, he sued a pretty recent graduate. I think he's in the late 20s, early 30s or something. He sued the Department of Education over his student loans. He was he is a very conservative MAGA guy. I think he's kind of a QAnon guy. Anyways, this guy sued the Department of Education over his student loans. His case was weak. I looked at it. It was racially charged, etc. So he lost his case, and then he lost his mind. He declared war on the federal government. He attempted to attack a federal facility. I don't know if it was military or civilian. I'm not sure about that. And then he murdered his own father, who was a federal pensioner. He
Well,
literally decapitated his own father. And
okay.
I'll leave it to your audience to Google that and get the
Yeah.
gory details. It's just too tragic for words. But that's only one example. A family of 8 in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma last year, or maybe I guess a year and a half ago now, they attempted to discharge their student loans in bankruptcy. So they filed for bankruptcy. They got all the shame of a bankruptcy. Apparently, they were probably misled by their lawyer, is my guess. But they found out the very hard way that student loans are uniquely non-dischargeable in
Right.
bankruptcy. And this is I don't know, I would say it's kind of a proud, conservative-ish white Christian family, 6 kids, mother and father, husband and wife, 6 kids. And the parents committed suicide and took all the children with them. It was just the saddest thing in the world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of the social instability that we are right now on the cusp of. So if I were a college president, I would be a little bit worried because at some point, when people lose their minds and do terrible, tragic, violent things, at some point, they stop going after innocent people. And at some point, they're probably going to start being a little smarter about who they target. And so, college presidents, college boards of trustees everywhere should really revisit their priorities and start thinking very sensibly about what they are doing to their own students and how that might come back to them at some point.
Yeah.
I
Um,
would I would be worried if I was a college president, quite frankly.
well, the way things are trending is not helping, right?
Yeah, where we're at right now, Jessica, and this is maybe the most important. All my points are important, but this is very important that people need to know. My best estimate is that today, somewhere around 85% of all student loan borrowers have stopped paying on their loans.
Yeah,
You,
let's talk
you,
about that for a minute. So
yes.
you're saying 80% in the country. Now, we've talked about this in prior episodes, but you've mentioned how many people in the United States are in debt, which is
So there's 43 million people in the country who have federal student loans.
okay, right.
Um,
So now if we take that and we can kind of understand how gargantuan this monster is. It's like a hydra because those are 43 million student borrowers who've taken loans out, many of whom, and I've mentioned this before, many of whom have children of their own, have elderly parents that they have to take care of, have mortgages they have to pay. In some instances, can't afford a mortgage, so they have rent and they can't hardly afford rent because they can't find a job. Like the doctors who don't match, for instance, who are in 6 figures of debt. This issue affects many more millions of people if you add all of those extra people on
yeah,
to
if you include their dependents and the people in their household who depend on, their
so
husbands, wives, girlfriend, boyfriend,
yeah, and
whoever.
it's conspicuously a silent issue in the media. It comes to the fore every now and then.
That's right. Here's a perfect example. Nowhere in the mainstream media will you see any statistic like what I just said, that 85% of the people aren't paying? The media will not report that. So what we see in the media currently is that, oh, the delinquency rate is 16%.
Mm.
And that to most people is like, oh, well, that's not great. It doesn't sound terrible.
Yeah,
That is a complete whitewash of what is actually going on with student loans.
right.
Most student loan borrowers, or certainly tens of millions, they are in deferment, they're in forbearance, or technically they're on some income-driven repayment plan, but
Mhm.
because their income is so low, they're making $0 payments.
That's right.
And so when you add up all the people who are in that situation, it turns out that only something like 8 million, maybe 7 million people
Or
are
able to
actually
even pay.
making payments on their student loans today.
Right.
That's less than 20% of the 43 million borrowers out there. Uh, so that's the big number that the media will not report.
That's
And
right.
believe me, I've sent my research to every reporter that I can think of. Very solid research, by the way. I've been interviewed on 60 Minutes, and I've broken news in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and I have supreme confidence, and I put my reputation on the line with the value and the quality of my research. What I just said is true.
Okay.
Only
And that,
20% of borrowers are paying. That's a dead lending system. That's a failed lending system.
yeah.
What else can you call that? I
So,
think the pandemic was probably the nail in the coffin.
so you're getting that figure, you're getting the 80% who are not paying. You're getting that from the Department of Education.
Yes, if you look at the Department of Education loan portfolio by loan status data, and I don't have the numbers on the top of my head here, but you can see the number of people who are in deferment, who are in a grace period, who are in forbearance, and how many are in repayment. But remember that probably 5 or 6 million people who are technically in repayment are making $0 payments
Mhm.
because their income is low. So, i.e., they are not paying.
So we were talking about the bill that Dick Durbin was going to pass that included the bankruptcy protections for student loan borrowers, which he quietly sort of reneged on at the last minute. We brought up Elizabeth Warren and how she was supporting it and then also pulled out herself. Probably we're thinking possibly due to lending lobby activity, right? Where there may be some kind of corruption going on. And
Maybe.
I'm comfortable with calling it that because that's what it is, right? When lobbyists can come in and hand people money to influence their political decisions, that's corruption. Um,
Well, I would say it wasn't necessarily to the lending lobby in the case of Warren and Durbin. I think it
okay,
was because of their fealty to the colleges, is
okay,
would be my best guess.
which is also a lobby.
Yes, it is a very
That's a
strong
lobby.
lobby. Look at where most or many political people go after they leave office. They go to teach at a college, or maybe be president of a college, or a
Mm,
trustee at a college. It's a
hmm.
revolving door. So,
Yeah, interesting
and
stuff.
Elizabeth Warren, ironically, taught and still is on the faculty, I believe,
Hmm.
of Harvard University, where she taught bankruptcy law. Ironically,
Very interesting.
we've
Yeah.
got we've got a long history with Senator Warren. I was on 60 Minutes top story in May 2006, and she was doing good research at the time. She was writing good stuff. I suggested they have her on the program.
Hmm.
They did. It was her first big splash in the national spotlight. And lo and behold, she ran for Senate 6 years later, and here we are today.
Hmm.
And
And
I
I'm
could
with
not be more
you.
disappointed that I have to be saying bad things about her.
Yeah, and I'm with you in the sense that I think that we need to be sort of nonpartisan about this, right? I'm not taking any particular political side here, and I think it would
It
be dangerous to do so.
towards the end of solving the student loan program, sticking with one party or another is suicide. It will
100%. Yeah.
guaranteed to not solve the problem.
Yes.
You've got to call out, you have to tell the truth, no matter who the truth impugns.
That's right. And as we know, as Jesus even spoke about, right? People, the world hates the truth. They do. The world hates the truth.
Jesus and, Mark Twain said that a lie can make it halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to even put its pants on in the morning.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Um, so I guess, circling back to the Dick Durbin thing here real quick, something I just want to go over quickly because you mentioned it to me on the phone. Uh, so the bill, due to the clawback in the bill, when he pulled that out at the last minute, the way it was originally written, it would have required the colleges themselves to pick up the tab of 50% of the debt,
50% of the amount originally borrowed.
of the
So that's a
amount
very
originally
small,
borrowed.
very
Okay.
small fraction of whatever the outstanding balance is typically.
Okay. And so
But
they
but
didn't
but
like
it was
that.
on a sliding scale too, don't forget. It was on a 0 to 50% sliding scale depending on the repayment rates and the default rates of the colleges. So for most colleges, it would have been a very small slap on the wrist.
Mhm,
Um, I don't, and again, the Department of Education just historically has never enforced these sorts of penalties and liabilities
mhm.
on the colleges.
Yeah.
So it was just a token gesture, really, and everybody who knows anything about this problem knew that, including the colleges, including the HBCUs, who are the reason given for killing the bill.
Right.
This was this was a completely political hit job that somebody did on this bill, and I suspect it was the colleges, probably was the lenders as well.
Sure.
May very well have been the Department of Education itself. The
Right.
Department of Education has fought tooth and nail to keep the leverage of bankruptcy gone from these loans. And I should probably say here quickly, Jessica, it's not that we want everybody to run out and file for bankruptcy. In
Right.
fact, nobody will actually have to file for bankruptcy. Just getting the leverage of bankruptcy returned is what is needed and what will compel massive, widespread reforms, widespread cancellations, breaks on interest, negotiated settlements, a reining in of the lending program, or in other words, more responsible lending, where they're not lending 250K to a kid or his parents to get
An education.
a marginal degree, or et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So everything good happens when the leverage of bankruptcy comes back. One other quick thing: the day after the leverage of bankruptcy is returned to these loans, every commercial bank in the nation, Citibank and J.P. Morgan Chase, et cetera, they will turn on a dime and they will start demanding those widespread reforms that I just mentioned,
Mhm,
because the commercial banks don't want to see a mass wave of bankruptcy filings where people will bring their other debt into the filings.
mhm.
They may file because of their student loans, but maybe they have a business loan or a car loan hanging around that they want to include in the bankruptcy.
Right.
Commercial banks do not want that.
Mhm.
So people don't understand why we fight so hard for the return of bankruptcy rights. But it has nothing to do with people filing. Very few people will ultimately wind up filing. In fact, nobody will really have to enjoy the benefits of the good faith that leverage will compel across the student loan system.
And that leverage is important, correct? When we revisit the Constitution and the constitutional protections given to American citizens, this is something that distinguished us in the beginning when we drafted the Constitution. The
This
framers,
goes, yes, this goes right to the heart of the founding of this country.
that's right.
Shortly after we won the revolution in 1780s, there was a debtors' revolt,
Mhm.
Shays' Rebellion, where um, sort of, I would call them militia in Western Massachusetts. They were tarring and feathering debt collectors, British banks, British agents, etc.
Mhm.
Not only British, American as well. There was damn near another revolution on our hands. This is what compelled George General Washington, President. Well, no, yeah, he was president by then. This is what compelled President Washington and Congress to write and ratify the Constitution. It was a debtor's rebellion.
Right.
So, and make no mistake, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, many of the founders, they themselves were being hurt badly under debt to typically to friends of the king, even after
From,
the revolution.
right.
And so
Mhm.
this goes, and the fact that they called for uniform bankruptcy laws, aka uniform bankruptcy rights, ahead of every right enumerated in the Bill of Rights, ahead of the power to declare war, ahead of the power to raise an army, that speaks volumes about how important it is for this country to be free of financial tyranny. You
Mm.
know, John Adams said there's two ways to conquer a country. You can do it through the sword, or you can do it by debt. And I have to say, this is that second thing for student loan borrowers. They become a financial enslavement tool where today they're a national threat. If you look at states across the country, more than half of the states, their people now owe more than their state budgets in federal student loan debt to the Department of Education. The Department of Education takes more interest out of the state of Maine, for example,
Mhm.
than all the lobsters harvested in Maine every year. So that's like one of Maine's biggest industries is lobster, right? Well, the fact that the Department of Education is snatching all of that and more in revenue in interest. So this is money created out of thin air, slapped onto the backs of the people in Maine. It's profit for the Department of Education. The people of West Virginia would have to give all of their coal export revenues to the Department of Education for 2 to 3 years just to pay off that state's student loan debt. And
Wow.
that doesn't include interest. One more quick example. So, Disney World in Florida, it's the biggest employer in the state. It brings in about $5 billion in revenue every year. Well, the Department of Education takes $6 billion in interest. Again, this is just artificial monopoly money created out of thin air. It's profit for the federal government, for the Department of Education. Department of Education takes $6 billion out of the state of Florida. Like these are the numbers that we're looking at. Maybe one last example: state of California. If you add up all the combined revenues of every major sports team in that state, and there's like 10 of them, from the San Diego Padres down south to the Golden State Warriors up in Sacramento, the Lakers, the Dodgers, every football, baseball, basketball team in that state. You add up all the annual revenue of all those sports franchises. The Department of Education takes $2 billion more than that combined in interest for federal student loans. So we're talking about the Department of Education single-handedly conquering and enslaving many states in this country. And the South, it's not the blue states that are hit worse, by the way. It's not. California is one of the better
I was
states,
just
actually.
gonna ask that. Would
It's
you
the
say,
southern states. It's the red states that are hurt. Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Georgia, North Carolina. They owe more than double their state budgets.
okay,
Uh,
now why, tell me, this is for people watching who don't understand. Why is that significant?
Well, I think it's very significant because that the worst hurt states are these red conservative states only proves how completely bamboozled, how fooled the people in Washington, D.C., how effectively they have fooled Republicans in these states. State of Texas, Department of Education, $151 billion in student loan debt, 130 billion is owed to the Department of Education. $10 billion a year in profit are taken by the Department of Education out of the people of Texas. But yet, if you talk to conservatives who don't know much about the student loan issue, they go, cancel student loans. No, you got to pay your loans. And because
Sure. Yeah.
they've been muppetized into fighting for the Department of Education
Yeah.
for the colleges that they claim to not like.
Mhm.
They've just been completely hoodwinked. Joseph Stalin would call them useful idiots, and I would too. I tell them, if you're really worried about communism, you should be fighting with me,
Uh-huh.
not against me,
Uh-huh.
because right now you're fighting for the colleges and the Department of Education and all that Marxist crap. I take no position. I don't think about it that deeply, but I just find the irony in how these people have been just brainwashed by the mainstream media.
Can I
Great.
interrupt you for one moment?
Yeah.
So piggybacking off of that, off of this reality, I was going to say idea, this reality that the red states are hit the hardest. Um, Other things we also know about the red states is they were historically associated with, politicians who wanted to maintain the slave class, right?
Mm,
So at
yeah.
what point can we say that this is a possibly extension or continuation of the slave class, where we have now a manifestation that has maybe metamorphosed, in our modern times? It's indentured servitude of 2025. Would you agree that it is indentured servitude? And especially if we look to Article 13 in the US Constitution, does it fall within the sort of purview of that?
I love that question. I'll leave it to other people to simply look and see what's happening in the South with student loan debt. They can come to their own conclusions. But I certainly think that the enslavement of not only people of color, remember, even in the South,
Right.
the vast majority of student loan borrowers are white.
Yeah.
Um, but something that goes unspoken about that time in our history, if you read the Fugitive Slave Act, if you read Article 13 in the Constitution,
Mhm.
you will see that both of those laws, both those pieces of legislation, they speak not only to slavery, they also speak to indentured servitude. The Fugitive Slave Law allowed rich landowners to capture not only black slaves, but also runaway indentured servants.
Right.
Um, and similarly, if you read Article 13, it says it abolishes not only slavery, but also indentured servitude. And, while it might be a bit of a stretch to classify student loans today as indentured servitude because, we're not doing physical labor for the Department of Education or for the lenders directly, it starts to look a lot like that. Even before the pandemic, 85% of all borrowers were never going to be able to repay their student loans for the rest of their lives. That starts to look a lot like indentured servitude to me. And many legal scholars agree, actually. There's a couple of papers I could point you to where
Yeah.
increasingly they're starting to draw those comparisons. Um, so yeah, it is probably a racist thing, and I can't get into the head of people like Albert Lord and other architects of this lending program, but to me, it's a class war.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's both, because remember, indentured servants were also very valuable commodities, like slaves were.
Sure.
Indentured servants back in the day were often not allowed off the ship until they signed a bond of indenture. Most indentured servants never survived to be free.
Mhm.
Um, and while certainly after slavery and indentured servitude was abolished via Article 13, um, sharecropping, poll taxes, those all applied to poor white people as well as black people. So I think there is a very serious racial angle to be had here, but I think personally, I think it's more productive to bring people together and make it more of a class thing,
I
because
do too. I do
it makes no
too.
sense to divide and
No,
say
it
this
doesn't. But
group
that's
deserves
that
something, this group does not, etc.
that's the narrative though that's pushed in the media all the time.
Well, that's a very helpful narrative to keep people divided and to keep the culture wars,
There it
preventing
is.
any real solution to this problem.
That's right. Yes, it
which is what
is.
rich people like to do, which is what
Yeah,
our betters, our overlords, the oligarchs, they love to get us fighting amongst ourselves, and there's no good
okay.
reason for it, certainly not on the student loan
It's
problem.
despicable. I was looking at some figures and it just blew my mind. I guess didn't really surprise me, but blew my mind just with the numbers themselves. 45 million people. If we times that by two, right? Let's pretend all of those 45 million people have at least one other person in their life that's significant to them in an intimate way, maybe a spouse, for instance,
Right.
or a child
Yeah.
or a parent.
Mhm.
If we times that by two, we're at 90 million.
It's enough
Uh,
people to elect a president.
yeah, if we times it by three, now let's say we have a spouse and a child, or a spouse and an elderly parent, that's 135 million people who are affected by the debilitating effect that this type of debt has on their
And
lives.
even just borrowers, we're talking about 1 in 4 of all adults in this country, between 1 and
Right,
5, 1 and 4.
right.
Huge numbers.
It's
To
huge.
It's too many
And
voters to, pretend they don't exist.
that's right. And it's also not surprising that it's kind of forbidden, to talk about in the media. The media doesn't cover this. They don't. Where are they? Trump is always talking about fake news, which is fine. And I agree with him, actually. I think that there are news agencies that do toe certain lines for certain reasons. And you can't trust everything out there, right? But we need independent, muckraking journalism again. We need people to come back and start focusing on issues that apparently the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about, probably because they're being told not to, right?
I
Um,
think you're exactly right, and even when I started student loan justice 20 years ago, the media wasn't great, but there were a few good reporters out there who were doing good stuff, few good networks out there. CBS News, 60 Minutes, they were willing to tell, at least most of the important truths. Today, that's all gone out the window since the subprime home mortgage crisis, since Occupy Wall Street. The media landscape has completely changed.
yeah,
We're dealing with media entities that they are essentially just mouthpieces for whoever's funding them. And that includes like PBS and NPR, by the way. Uh, um,
yeah,
they serve the Department of Education federal interests. They serve private lender interests.
yeah.
The media is crap. Donald Trump, whatever you think about Donald Trump, and I'm not necessarily a fan of Trump, but whatever you feel about Trump, he's right about the news. The news has become fake, far
Yeah,
faker today than it was 20 years ago.
yeah.
I don't think the media has ever been great, honestly. Back when there was ABC and CBS and NBC, and that was it. I think it was propaganda, then as well. But 20 years ago, we had really good independent media. We had reporters that were actually doing independent journalism. Today, I can only point to maybe 3 reporters that I have any respect for at all. Matt Taibbi still every once in a while will do good stuff on student loans. Maybe just a small handful of other independent journalists out there.
Mhm.
But don't go, don't look to any of the networks, certainly none of the financial media, to do meaningful coverage on this issue.
No,
Um,
if
and,
they
and
talk
that
about it at all, they're towing the line.
and that most of all, the worst entity for student loan reporting is bar none Forbes magazine. That's
Mm,
where most people they break the biggest headlines on student loans. But I'm here to tell you, Forbes magazine is garbage. The people who write at Forbes magazine, they make money on the federal student loan program.
right. You
Like
mentioned
Adam
that once
Minsky,
before, yeah.
he's a predator. He preys on defaulted student loan borrowers, and these are my words, not yours. I'm speaking for myself here, but I
Mhm.
know for a fact that Adam Minsky sells people. He preys upon defaulted student loan borrowers.
Hey,
Um,
on that note, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but has
sure.
anyone ever come for you? Has anyone ever tried to like bring you down or defame you or? accuse you of
Well,
things.
no, people can accuse me all they want, but I am ethically pure.
Right.
I've had shady, sleazy come-ons from dozens of collection industry interests wanting to do, a strategic partnership with me and revenue sharing and this and that, primarily by duping defaulted borrowers into rehabilitating their loans.
Mhm.
This is a shameful process where you pay and you pay for 10 months, they take your loans out of default, you sign for a much, much larger loan. And whoever does that gets a 16% commission from the government, from the
Mm.
taxpayer. So if you default on a loan, it's $50,000, you go through loan rehabilitation, you sign for a new loan for $100,000. Whoever gets you to do that gets a $16,000 check from the government for
Mm.
almost no work from the taxpayers. That's what these con artists, including Adam Minsky,
Mhm.
and I don't know how he's making money out of the deal, and maybe he's getting only a share. I don't know. That's a good question for Adam. But I can tell you that this is what those people do. They railroad people into consolidations,
Right.
rehabilitations, and just a word to the wise student loan borrowers out there: do not rehabilitate your loans. There is an 80% chance that you will wind up defaulting again on your loans. So what started as a $35 headache, $35,000 headache, can very quickly explode to $250,000 catastrophe in your
Right.
life. It's just terrible. And the fact that people like Adam Minsky, writer at Forbes magazine, are pushing people into this is just disgusting. They know full well what the true risks are here.
Yeah.
And shame on them. Shame on the media.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just
You
and
know,
this is why shows like yours, Jessica, are just so important. People have to start trusting people again,
yeah.
not trusting the media, certainly on the student loan issue.
Yeah.
People need to do their own research and look at the data that I look at. Just go to the Department of Education. Um,
People are harmed every day, millions of people. And you have been doing this since 2005. I obviously jumped on the bandwagon about 4 years ago. And I think we just need more people talking about it. And on that note, there are a couple more questions I have for you, but for
okay.
anyone who is interested in sharing your story with me, I would love to talk to you. Reach out to me at radfuturesnow at gmail.com and let me know if you have a particular story that you'd like to share. Particularly, I'm interested in doctors without jobs. If you're in six figures of debt and you want to talk about it and you're not afraid, come on my show. Let's talk about it. If you're someone else from the other side of the aisle who disagrees with forgiveness, I'd love to talk to you too. So reach out to me, radfuturesnow at gmail.com. But the other question I have for you, one of them anyways, on the Department of Education front, right? So you spoke about that earlier. You said that the Secretary Director of the Department of Education can legally cancel 90% of all student loan debt, should they choose. They have thus far chosen not to, correct? However, so recently we obviously have the Trump administration signing the executive order to nullify the entire Department of Education. Can you tell me, how do you feel about this? What's going to come of it? There's been rumors, or I don't know if it's rumor or what, but there's talk about the loans and the administration of the loans and the debt being shifted to the Small Business Administration. Can you make any comments on this? Do you think it's a good idea that the
it's
Department of
it's all
Education?
Yeah, it's all bluff and bluster. Don't believe it, guys. By law, the Department of Education owns and controls federally owned student loans. They're not going anywhere. The Department of Education still exists and still will exist until Congress changes that. Congress will not change that, including Republicans in Congress. The Department of Education is not going anywhere. Uh, they may have assigned servicing of the loans to the SBA, but make no mistake, those loans are still owned by the Department of Education and controlled by the Secretary of Education and President Trump, who directs the secretary. It's just bluff and bluster. They're just trying to make it look good. Promises made, promises kept. It's nonsense. but indeed, I am quite worried that they will try and repeal the law that allows the secretary very broad powers to cancel loans. But I don't think they will. And this is a much deeper conversation than we have time for here today. But I'll just say the law that gives the secretary very broad authority to cancel loans also gives the secretary a broad authority to sell the federal student loan portfolio. And honestly, having looked at this for many years, seeing what the Republicans have done, not done, other my spider senses, I think there's a very strong interest among Trump's administration, people around him, very strong, and Wall Street, very strong interest in selling this portfolio off to Wall Street for pennies on the dollar. I wrote an article about this last week. Everything that I'm seeing looks like they are attempting to plunge the market value of the federal portfolio as low as they possibly can, so that perhaps Wall Street investors will scoop up the portfolio for pennies on the dollar.
Okay, so now is this the same or different from the student loan backed securities, student loan debt backed securities?
Well, we don't know what it would look like. Right now, there's a very small tranche of legacy asset-backed securities slabs from the old style student loans. What a sale of the current federally owned portfolio would look like, whether it would retain some sort of government guarantee, um, we don't know. It would be complicated. But I do know that there is a lot of interest in that because Wall Street would love to take these loans off the hands of the taxpayer for pennies on the dollar. Because remember, these loans generate $106 billion a year in
Mhm.
interest,
Yeah.
and Wall Street would much rather that interest accrue to them than accrue to the Department of Education. So I think we'll probably know more about this in the coming months. Um, but if it does happen, you heard it here first.
Okay. Let's discuss for a moment performative forgiveness. This is something that the Biden administration engaged in, and I would like to talk about it for a moment. Biden's administration used it as a tool to leverage votes, right? He put this forgiveness forward and kind of dangled it like a carrot in front of Democratic voters prior to the midterm elections, which carried his party through the midterms, obviously. And then he did forgive, you know, he did forgive loans, but it was really blown out of proportion, in my opinion, the way it was covered in the media. Everybody was like, oh, there's this sweeping student loan debt forgiveness. Oh my God. And the thing that was really cleverly crafted about that narrative is that they did not discuss the fact that it affected almost no one. They forgave the loans of people who were working in public service positions, and I think I don't know, the state and federal government, and then perhaps teachers and things like that. I don't know, but you would probably know more about that. But it felt to me that it was very performative and used as a tool to just kind of float the party.
It was totally performative. Before the 2020 election, Joe Biden was saying, if you went to a public college and you earn less than $125,000, I will eliminate your student loan debt. Shortly after he got elected, he goes, "Oh no, I won't be doing that." What Biden did, Jessica, was simply point to loans that had been probably most should have been canceled years or decades ago through existing programs like
Yeah.
public service, like income-based repayment. Um, so he just pointed to this $170 billion in loans that were, and most of the borrowers who got who got that benefit, they had repaid far more than they borrowed. Make no mistake, the
Yeah.
government did make money on those loans. But $170 billion in canceled loans. I call it cancellation, by the way. I don't call it forgiveness.
Yeah.
I think that's a insulting term. We haven't
Yeah.
done anything to be forgiven. We haven't
Good
sinned
point.
to be
Good
forgiven for
point.
nonsense.
Yeah.
Um, but $170 billion sounds like a lot until you realize that over 4 typical years, the student loan portfolio with interest and new loans, it increases by nearly $800 billion. So Joe Biden or Donald Trump or the next president, they could cancel $170 billion every 4 years, as much as they want. And the student loan portfolio and the number of borrowers will still grow astronomically by like $1.6 trillion over 10 years. So it was, I love that word performative. That's exactly what it was. Um,
Yeah.
but the proof is in the pudding. When the time came for the Democrats to return standard bankruptcy rights to the loans in 2022 under Biden, when they had the power, they betrayed and abandoned us. It worked in the 2020 election, but by 2024, people started to realize, hey, we're being strung along here. And quite frankly, I think, in fact, I'm sure that this is the reason that the Democrats lost the 2024 election. They
One
did
of
not
them. Yeah,
keep
for
their
sure.
promises. And,
Yeah.
people don't know much about student loans, including student loan borrowers. They just don't. But
Yeah.
people aren't stupid. People can sense when they're being played for a fool. And the Democrats tried to play us for a fool, not once, but twice. It worked the first time, did not work the second time. And sadly, I don't see the Democrats doing anything to acknowledge that. I see them doubling down on just nonsense. The limousine elite, the Nancy Pelosi and the San Francisco billionaires and all these people who opposed student loan cancellation, by the way. Nancy Pelosi sabotaged student loan cancellation. Um, that's the limousine liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And I include many people in there, people like Ezra Klein, people who say that student loan cancellation benefits the rich. That's an absolute bald-faced lie.
Yeah.
85% of all borrowers cannot afford to make payments on their loans. They are not rich.
Well,
Um,
the process of taking them out and qualifying for student loans to begin with, you have to fall under
you
a
have to be
certain.
financially needy in order to get a student loan. Yes,
That's
exactly.
it. It's like,
And
hello,
the
poor
fact, and
people are
yes,
taking these loans out, and this is another tool of indentured servitude. It's the
right.
extension of slavery. I don't care what anybody says.
It's
That's what
it's
it
it's
is.
it's a class war.
Yes, it is. It
It's
needs to stop. And if the Trump administration wants this country to really be made great again, you will figure it out and you will cancel this debt so that the people can be relieved of this burden and
I
inject
agree.
that money
I
into
I
the
agree completely.
economy. You want
And
people to buy
remember,
cars, you want people to buy goods, you want people to do things with their money that is
start
not.
families, buy homes, start
Oh my God.
businesses,
Yeah.
everything that normal people do. Um, and remember this, Jessica, and everybody out there, remember, math is on our side. The
Yeah.
loans will not be paid.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The loans are garbage. The loans will not be paid. Therefore, the loans absolutely will be canceled, whether you like that or not. The loans, probably 80% of that portfolio will be canceled.
Yeah.
Now, whether we cancel 1.7 trillion today or whether we cancel 4 trillion 10 years from now or whatever it winds up being, the loans will be canceled.
Yeah.
So I would argue sooner is better.
Sooner, sooner
We
the
need
better.
to take this sucker to the bath and drown it in the tub. We need to replace this scam with something that actually works, that doesn't allow the colleges to engorge themselves, that doesn't wreck 85% of the people who get the loans.
Right.
That's not what the founding fathers had in mind. And
No.
in fact, the founders are on our side. The
Yeah.
founders need us to succeed. So take
Yeah.
heart.
Yeah, thank you. We have 1 minute left. So I just want to take this time to thank you for joining me again. And I would love to reconnect at some point in the near future, just to kind of check in with you and see what, if there's any news.
Yeah, things are changing very quickly, so I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. We'll see you around.
Thank you,
Have a
Jessica.
great, have a great day.
You
Bye-bye.
too.